In every dynasty, there is a final voice, the echo before silence. Tonight, the Court of the Crane summons that echo. Her name, Princess Deokhye, the last daughter of Joseon. Born into twilight, raised under occupation, she lived between two worlds, one fading and one forced upon her. Her story is one of sorrow wrapped in ceremony, rebellion disguised as duty, and a slow descent into the kind of loneliness that only history remembers. This is not just the story of a princess. It is the story of a kingdom's last heartbeat, the wound of a nation sealed behind palace walls. Deokhye was born in 1912 in Changdeokgung Palace, the daughter of Emperor Gojong, the 26th monarch of the Joseon Dynasty, and the first emperor of Korea under the short-lived Korean Empire. By the time she entered the world, the empire her father had built was already gone. 2 years earlier, in 1910, Japan had annexed Korea. The royal family was stripped of power, their empire dissolved, their sovereignty reduced to spectacle. Yet within the halls of Changdeokgung, Gojong still held court in miniature. Rituals continued, ministers bowed, the illusion of royalty maintained. And in that illusion, the birth of Deokhye was a glimmer of defiance. Her father adored her. She was his youngest, a delicate child with bright eyes in a calm, intelligent manner. He insisted she be raised as a real princess, not as a relic. She had her own palace, Deokhyejang, built for her within the royal grounds. Inside its flowered courtyards, she learned poetry, etiquette, music, and the Confucian rituals of her ancestors. But beyond those walls, the empire that once bowed to her family's seal was now governed by Japanese officials. To the Japanese, Deokhye was not just a child. She was a symbol, proof that Joseon's royal line still flowed, that the embers of sovereignty had not died. And to an occupying power, such symbols were dangerous. Symbols had to be erased. In January 1919, when Deokhye was just 7, tragedy struck. Emperor Gojong, her father, her protector, died suddenly. The official record said it was illness, but the Korean people whispered otherwise, that he had been poisoned by the Japanese, silenced before he could rally support for independence. His funeral became more than a farewell. It became a spark. Tens of thousands filled the streets in mourning, chanting his name. That grief transformed into fury. The March 1st movement was born, Korea's first mass cry for independence. Protesters waved banners, shouted for freedom, and among their whispered vows was one repeated in secret: protect the princess. But the uprising was crushed with violence. Thousands were arrested or killed, and the palace gates shut tighter than ever. In that year, Deokhye's childhood ended. The laughter palace gardens was replaced by silence. The child who once played in silk courtyards now lived under watch, the last royal daughter in a land no longer her own. In the 1920s, Japan perfected its colonial policy, control through assimilation. For Deokhye, that meant education, but it was not a gift, it was exile. She was taken to Tokyo and enrolled in Gakushuin, a school for Japanese nobility. It was a place of discipline and hierarchy, where every bow, every syllable was meant to reshape her. Her name was spoken with Japanese pronunciation. Her Korean attendants were replaced with imperial staff who reported on her every move. Letters from home were intercepted. Her meals, her visitors, monitored. Even her hanbok was restricted. The vibrant silks of Joseon replaced by muted uniforms. On paper, she was being modernized. In truth, she was being erased. In her private notebooks, later preserved, she wrote of Changdeokgung's gardens, of the scent of lotus flowers and her father's laughter. "I dream of the palace," she wrote. "I dream of returning home." Even surrounded by Tokyo's luxury, she lived as a prisoner of politeness, every smile rehearsed, every word translated. A princess without a country. By 1931, Deokhye was 19, and Japan had other plans for her. She was ordered to marry Count So Takeyuki, a Japanese aristocrat. On paper, it was an alliance between two noble houses. In truth, it was an act of political theater, binding the last bloodline of Joseon to the Japanese elite. Her father's line, her dynasty, her culture, sealed into silence with a wedding ceremony. The event was lavish. Nobles, diplomats, and photographers filled the halls. But witnesses remember her face. Eyes lowered, her expression hollow. She did not speak. It was not a marriage. It was a surrender, veiled in flowers. A year later, in 1932, she gave birth to a daughter, Masai So. For a brief time, joy returned. She adored her child, wrote poems about her laughter. But the isolation of her marriage deepened. Her husband was distant, often absent, involved in affairs. Deokhye, foreign in language, family, and home, began to fracture. Her letters grew erratic. She wept uncontrollably. Servants described her pacing for hours, speaking to people who weren't there. By the mid-1930s, Japanese newspapers began referring to her illness coldly, the fallen princess. Diagnosed with schizophrenia, she was institutionalized in Matsuzawa Hospital in Tokyo. Her life became a blur of sterile walls and shock therapy. The girl who once played among royal pawns now stared at ceilings, repeating the same words. "I must go home. Father is waiting." In Korean folklore, madness was once called shimbyong, a spirit sickness of grief too great to bear. Deokhye's illness was not myth. It was history breaking her mind. When World War II ended in 1945, the world changed overnight. Japan surrendered. Korea was free again. But freedom never came for Deokhye. The empire she was born into was gone. The country she longed for was divided between North and South. The monarchy abolished. Her husband divorced her. Her daughter, Masai, grew estranged and later disappeared, believed to have died by suicide in the 1950s. Deokhye was left with nothing. For more than 15 years, she lived in institutions, drifting between treatments and care homes. To the world, she was forgotten. But to historians and those who remembered the old palace, she remained a ghost story, the princess who never came home. In 1962, the efforts of Korean officials, journalists, and relatives, Deokhye was finally allowed to return. 50 years old, frail, her memory scattered by illness, she stepped onto Korean soil again, and when her feet touched the tarmac at Seoul Airport, the crowd erupted in tears. The princess had returned. Newspapers printed her photograph, small, hunched, but still regal. She smiled faintly, as if recognizing a land she'd only seen in dreams. But home had changed. The palaces were now museums. The dynasty she represented, long dead. She wandered the gardens of Changdeokgung, touching old trees, whispering her father's name. For the rest of her life, she lived quietly, cared for by her nephew, King Yeongchin's family. Visitors said she was gentle, sometimes lucid, sometimes lost. When she spoke, it was often of her childhood, the swing in her garden, the songs of her attendants, her father's laughter echoing through the corridors of Deokye. In 1989, at the age of 77, Princess Deokhye passed away in Changdeokgung, the palace where she was born, the palace she never stopped dreaming of. Her funeral was modest, but for the people who attended, it was more than a farewell. It was closure, for her and for the dynasty that had ended decades before. The last princess of Joseon, laid to rest within the gardens of her childhood, a life that began in silk and ceremony and ended in silence and shadow. In legend, royal daughters were guardians of dynasties, bringers of fortune, but Deokhye was born too late, into a kingdom already dismantled. She was not just a victim of empire, she was the embodiment of its loss. Her madness, her exile, her return, each was a reflection of Korea's own history, conquered, divided, yearning for home. Even now, artifacts of her life, her dolls, her schoolbooks, her letters, rest in the National Palace Museum, silent witnesses to a story both royal and unbearably human. Was she a tragic figure, or was she the last living reminder that some wounds never heal? Tonight, the Court of the Crane closes its book on Princess Deokhye, the last princess of Joseon, a symbol of grace turned sorrow, a child of empire turned exile, and a woman whose quiet suffering became the echo of a fallen throne. Remember, in the Court of the Crane, history is never buried. It lingers, it waits, until its shadows are heard.